welcome to NOAHE Round 7, Session 5. My name is Negar Razavilar, and I will be facilitating this session. Please join me in welcoming our presenter, Sasha van Katwyk. Sasha is an economist specializing in simulation modeling methods and decision analysis. His primary interest is to improve the transparency, utility, and adoption of mathematical modeling as an accessible tool for evidence-based decision-making. Prior to IHE, he was a health economist at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute and a research fellow in Cape Town, specializing in social protection policy design. He holds an MSc in Public Policy and Risk Assessment from Maastricht University and a BA in Economics. Today's topic is early HTA or EHTA, a new methodology for trying to answer the same questions with less data. During today's talk, Sasha will summarize ongoing attempts at a better defined multidisciplinary approach to EHTA that estimates the potential value of a pre-research technology, quantifies the risk profile for different stakeholders, and minimizes research investment waste. He will raise some questions for discussion, including whether or not these methods represent a significant departure from current HTA practices, whether these analyses can pay for themselves through averted wastage, and how many academics it takes to agree on a common name for their field of research when they're competing for grant funding. So before we begin, I'll go over some event housekeeping. Participants will be muted throughout the webinar. To submit any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A function. Just a friendly reminder that the Q&A function is different from the chat function. The Q&A answering your questions will be facilitated during the final 20 minutes of the webinar. Thank you again for joining us. I will now hand over to Sasha.
Thanks, Nagar. Thanks for everyone who is in attendance. As was described in the abstract, today is going to be a little bit more, I'm hoping for it to be a little bit more of a discussion. I'm going to sort of introduce what early HTA is and sort of go through a couple of use cases of it, and then sort of hopefully just sort of give you a sense of my area of exploration into this space. I'll start off by saying the reason I'm exploring this space is because I, along with Elaine Friedenberger, at IHE are the co-leads of the early economic evaluation portfolio, which does early health technology assessment specifically for small and medium-sized enterprises through various accelerator partnerships that IHE has with provinces. So that is sort of why I've been watching this space and being engaged in the ongoing discussions around what early HTA is, what the methodologies are, how it should be used. And so I'll sort of be exploring and introducing to you my take of what I'm seeing so far, and hopefully sort of get some feedback from you guys and a little bit of discussion and answer any questions you might have. This is certainly not meant to be a presentation of expertise in the topic. Indeed, as we get into this, you'll sort of recognize that expertise would be sort of a false terminology for this. It's a very early stage concept, and the scope of methods and intention and function of these analyses are still very much under debate, which is sort of what I was referencing in that last question in the abstract, which was around, how many academics does it take to agree on a name for a thing? Because as we will find, there are quite a few names for similar methods. So first, I'm just going to go through a definition of early HTA, and indeed the proposed definition that is currently under consideration through a Delphi process that is ongoing, and sort of the various other terminologies that have been employed by different people from different fields who are all sort of trying to engage with this space at the same time. I'm then going to I'm not going to go through any explicit studies or anything like that, but I will be sort of talking about various applications and use cases for early HTA, and finally sort of end with some key discussion questions that I'm happy to explore. I'm also happy to just answer questions, but I would be most interested in what you guys think. and sort of get your perspective on some of this. So let's start with what do we mean when we say, I'm gonna assume that everyone has some familiarity with health technology assessment, given what we do. But what do we mean when we say an HTA is early? Well, the term early HTA is not new, and in fact, this particular study was a 2011 study, I believe, that had sort of mapped out a version of the product life cycle where HTAs are employed. And in this diagram, they sort of presented early HTA as one, not really something that perfectly aligns with first clinical use or first market access, but is sort of correlated, associated with that there is a time spectrum. An early HTA happens somewhere at the beginning, and the very beginning would be sort of the ideation of the technology in question, or the recognition of the need for technology, of an improvement in technology. And at that point, you're getting very basic research on a product where you're potentially targeting a specific cohort or a specific product that's the current standard of care you're trying to challenge. You're sort of implementing a proof of principle, you're implementing some sort of prototype, and all of those things are happening at the very early stages, and evidence generation is beginning. And usually clinical, technical research is the starting point. And we really only think of economic analysis or health economists having a really active role at sort of the later staging of HTA. That's not a hard, fast rule. Economists have been involved from day one in lots of projects. There's very little in this area that we could say definitively here. There's an absolute definition or categorization for any of this. But this particular paper I find is a good diagram for describing what we mean by early HTA, and indeed in this case they differentiate between very early and early as a differentiation of what type of research is ongoing. The other thing I like about this graph that I draw attention to is actually the bottom, which is I like the I actually put a blue triangle around it, which is the amount of decision uncertainty that we're dealing with here. And I actually this is very much my opinion, but you know, it's an opinion shared by these authors at least, that really when we're talking about early HTA, the most important feature defining early HTA is the level of decision uncertainty that you were facing, and that there are certain kinds of evidence uncertainty that translates into decision uncertainty, decision risk. And as you get further information, further data, more specific evidence through not just the obvious options like trials, but through the collection of observational data, identification of whatever market you're actually wanting to enter in first, and then starting the evidence generation process that is very specific to your technology. All of those avenues of research provide the level of certainty necessary for more sophisticated and more robust analysis that allows for decision makers to have a level of confidence in the analysis, but also allows the researchers to provide a certain kind of analysis that we're very familiar with, like cost utility. And that those are the kinds of things that traditionally, when you look at HTA guidance and reporting, and how we often talk to our stakeholders about what is the caliber of evidence necessary for a decision to get to a health authority or to a healthcare decision maker or ultimate purchaser, we're really talking about a standard of evidence that is often not really available at the early stages of a technology. But that is where oftentimes, when we're talking about what is an early HTA, we're kind of describing that period of time before we have the sufficient level of evidence to do the standard practices, the robust analysis of a CUA that would be traditionally expected. Again, these are broad generalizations. This is a spectrum We don't have a caliber of evidence that is indexable that lets us simplify this and say that there's a definitive point at which HTA no longer is early. But that's the way I like to think about it, and it's often sort of the frame around a lot of the discussions that are happening in this space. So I'd mentioned before that there is sort of a current posed definition of early HTA, and I very much mean it as I say. There is a current activity going on that I am somewhat involved in that is, I'm certainly not the driver of it, but I'm involved in the discussion around what is early HTA and setting a formal definition, as far as academics can agree to a singular definition. And so this is the current, I think this is the second edition version of the HTA following two Delphi surveys that have gone out to experts. It's possible there are people in this call who were part of that survey. Their definition focuses on two key components that I can also say as being part of the review of those surveys and part of the discussion around what are we supposed to do with this definition, how do we refine this definition. The two major themes that I identified as really critical as part of that discussion was that early HTA is one, a health technology assessment. It's not like we're distinguishing this as not HTA, but more importantly, that it's about informing decisions informing decisions that aren't necessarily a final adoption decision, but informing other aspects of the HTA lifecycle. So that's point one: the informing of different kinds of decisions than are traditionally sort of the bread and butter, the main objective of HTA. Again, HTA has many objectives, but this is not about making a yes/no decision about purchasing, or do you not continue research. That's not what early HTA is meant to address. It's about more process-oriented decision making. And the second is the importance of differentiating from value and potential value. This is a critical feature, in no small part because the level of evidence that is available is considered to be at sort of the lowest level it's going to be throughout the process. So when we're talking about a value proposition of a technology, we're not really talking about quantifying that value proposition with a high level of certainty. We're talking about trying to find ways of calculating potential value from a given technology. And there's a variety of ways to get to those kinds of potential value calculations. And actually, I think that particular part of this question is the most interesting to me. And so that's what we're going to get into a little bit more. So when I describe it as sort of a word salad, or say that there's sort of multiple ways that academics and practitioners of early HTA define these terms, I mean that they don't all call it early HTA, for one. The current working group calls it early HTA because that's the phrase that the co-chairs like the best, and I think is actually a very good description. It's not actually what I originally called it. The whole portfolio at IHE is called Early Economic Evaluation, not Early HTA. Why? Because I like E3 better. There isn't a whole lot of science behind the decision making. I just thought it made more sense. But I like Early HTA. It's a good one. There are a couple of other ones that are really popular, and if you search for this stuff in your journal browser of choice, you'll find a variety of different definitions or terminologies that all capture the similar kinds of concepts. Things like hospital-based HTA, for which there is the HTAI has a new working group called the Hospital-Based HTA Working Group, where they're focusing on very similar questions that we're talking about here, but very specifically to hospital-based HTA. So what kinds of analysis, HTA analysis, is happening inside a health institution? That's largely what they're describing. I won't speak for them. I think they're in the same process of trying to dictate the definitions and work out what exactly the scope of their analysis is. Other ones are things like development-focused HTA. There's lots of different studies for this. I think one of the most common uses of things like development focused are we're actually more thinking about higher level policy questions around what is societal value of improvements in health technologies, and how do we quantify those, and how do we set priorities for ongoing funding decisions and ongoing funding priorities. And so it's a much more policy oriented set of questions that are trying to sort of pull from HTA, but are coming at it from the side of policymakers. Another one that I've seen is early dialogue, which I find the least descriptive, but there is a pretty high level of analysis that's been done in this area, and I've seen it from industry, I've seen it from policy, where that's sort of the terminology that they're using, all within the same space. It's not a perfect overlap, but this early HTA, I think if it is the successful terminology, it'll take time. I think it's going to be that there's sometimes it'll be classified as early HTA, and sometimes some of these terminologies might maintain their own niche. I don't know the sociology of these things, but I expect it's complicated. But that's what we're sort of talking about, and as part of the process of defining early HTA is what is it, and what other kinds of activities that are going on sort of fall within this category. I think the other thing that has been interesting as part of this process and exploring what has been written using all of a variety of names, those 5 are not the only ones, there's many more, but those are the most common. A lot of these are really coming down to, from my interpretation, questions about that there are stakeholders who are interested in very similar questions. They're coming at this from their respective fields, their respective orientation of how they think about a health technology or a health system, or how to make decisions based on limited information. And they are bringing their own vernacular and their own methods to that conversation. And some of these stakeholders are very familiar to health economists, including health economists themselves. I would define ourselves as stakeholders in this discussion. And there are many others that we're familiar with, but there are others that maybe we are less familiar with or are considered sort of specialized areas of work, including in the case of IHE, our E3 portfolio, is really focused on industry, on small and medium-sized enterprises, and sort of being a bridge for them at their very early stages of technology development, and just giving them a little bit of a bridge into understanding what goes into the kinds of healthcare decision making that will ultimately dictate whether or not their product is considered cost effective and ultimately gets adopted, and what kinds of evidence is involved in getting them from point A where they are to the next step. And that's just one stakeholder perspective, and there are many others. Things like the development-focused HTAs, like I mentioned, sort of talk about social interest a lot, and the policy discussions around how to quantify that are very different from the kinds of discussions and the kinds of indicators that are familiar to health economists. Things like qualities and utility measures are fairly constraining to a lot of these stakeholders. They don't see that as necessarily the best capture of benefit, and potentially cost saving is also not necessarily the best quantifier of benefit. So there's a lot of this discussion, I would argue, is more around how do we do a better job of capturing a wider set of stakeholder perspectives. And there's nothing about that has anything to do with early. we can do that at every stage. But I am noticing that a lot of the early HTA discussion, because it is at a very nascent stage in its development as a methodology and as sort of a subfield of its own, it is grappling with this in a very active way, and that makes it really interesting, and something that adds more depth to the methods discussion. So there have been some studies that have already looked at evaluating early HTA, trying to describe what are use cases for early HTA, what kind of methods are used for early HTA. And indeed, at this point, there's been systematic reviews of those analyses, not many, I think less than 5. But there's a lot of attention growing in this space. But I would also flag that this is not an overwhelming area of research. I think in the last systematic review that I had seen, less than 1,000 papers, but at just the highest level of screening were identified as applicable. So this is not a huge space yet. So if there's anyone on the call that's looking for a study area, you can get down on the ground floor with this stuff. It's very early in many ways. So the one particular paper that had looked at sort of the methods of, in this particular case, they were looking specifically at early assessments of societal value of health technologies, but actually it very much stretched its legs beyond that. So I'm using this as sort of the principal example of where early HTA thinking is at the moment. And they sort of identified that a lot of the questions around what makes early HTA and how do we differentiate early from standard HTA is around a broader definition of value and recognizing that early on for the purposes of then aligning the final analysis that you're doing and the kind of information and the kind of decision insights that you're giving to your stakeholders, aligning that more around a broader definition of what they value, because it may not be that you have sufficient data to do a cost utility analysis. And indeed, it may be that if you're looking at something like a producer who is way too early on in the process to be thinking about things like health utilities, they are interested in different pieces of information. They're interested in different measures of value at this stage to just verify and validate that they have a product that is worth investing further in. And indeed, the investors and the funders have different definitions of that. And those definitions may not have anything to do with this technology ultimately getting reimbursed or paid for. That might not be their priority right now. R&D is a very messy, going all over the place kind of thing. And a lot of times, even in our discussions with SMEs, it's not always the case that it's as simple as saying, well, this is whether or not your technology is cost effective is the core question. Not always. A lot of time, but not always. And so with that in mind, they had identified sort of 4 major areas of methodologies that all come together, and they would sort of argue are all part of an early HTA process. The first is around sort of exploring the nature and the magnitude of the problem itself. And a lot of this area actually has a lot to do with sort of, if people are familiar with sort of pathway models, or I think they're also called, they have lots of names, but like road models, sort of mapping out the current standard of care, the current process that a technology or cohort that is of interest is meant to represent what is currently going on within the health system. And the methods around that are a lot more focused on stakeholder engagement, expert elicitation, patient engagement, narrative descriptions of what the healthcare system is. For health economists on the call who have gone through the process of like a pathway model, you're aware that it is a very intensive process where you're talking to a lot of people, especially if the system isn't very straightforward, that there are lots of ad hoc options available to patients, and maybe not all of them are directly paid for by the health system. There could be private options. There could be sort of these you grab it when you need it options, and how do you incorporate that, and do you incorporate that? Who needs to make the decision about what's included and what isn't? If it isn't paid for by the health system, but the health system is making the decision here, do they even care about what's going on in the private system? That's actually a complicated question most of the time. And so that's sort of one area of methods of how do you do that process well. The second is methods for estimating the nature and the magnitude of the value that might be expected of this. This can be modeling. It is often modeling. I think in this paper, they quantified a lot of this as modeling examples. But it isn't always. It can also be qualitative, so there is some exploration of that. But a lot of the modeling work sort of captured in that, which I'm a math modeler. I'm drawn to that kind of stuff, but it's certainly not the full extent of what's inside that methods portfolio. The next is around setting those sets of conditions that need to be met in order to make the next decision. You see this at every stage of HTA, and it's great that it's getting so much more attention. And I think there's so much great methodology work that's going on. Some that's been presented as part of these rounds around how do we have conditional decision making? How do we incorporate that? Do we have things we can imagine value-based pricing or sort of staged conditional decision making. And similarly, from the early HTA perspective, there's lots of interesting discussion going on around, should we be sort of insisting on funders to sort of, when they're setting priorities of what kinds of research they want to be investing in, or that they want to be grading for the purposes of then making a decision about who gets grant financing, should there be conditions that are more specifically associated with what is the actual added decision certainty that is going to be provided through additional research evidence. And for those who are familiar with VOI or do VOI, I imagine your head just pinged a little bit, because that's very much the space of VOI. And within that methods bin number 3, that's also where they sort of identified value of information, expected value of partial perfect information, and then how additional research that is specifically targeting certain kinds of evidence uncertainty and directly correlating ex ante prior to an actual model being built, but saying we know that in X condition we don't have utility measures that are very useful, or they don't really account for a critical heterogeneity within this cohort. We need better data here. We can't make any good decisions, regardless of the technology, any good decisions within this space. So if there's going to be research in this space, we really want this area of focus, and we're willing to value it. Like, we're willing to actually quantify that. Should that be something that is directly part of a funder's decision-making process and priority setting? That's a really cool idea, and I think there's a lot of really interesting, complicated conversations that would have to happen for something like that to happen. But it is very much in the early HTA dialogue right now. And the last is methods to help develop and design the type of research that is needed. Again, this does touch on VOI very similarly, but they're actually more specifically in this case. They are talking about value of information. But the other thing I wanted to point out with this one that I wanted to differentiate from it was that it's also about that first part, the designing the type of research, and when we're talking about a broader definition of stakeholder value. Are there types of outcome measures that need to be accounted for that should be part of the ultimate decision making, that broaden the definition of what constitutes a yes or no answer to the question of should we invest further and what we should invest further in. And again, there's lots of complicated discussions to be had around, how do you elicit different kinds of evidence, and what if you need to weight them differently, or if they need to be, how do you differentiate between one measure, like let's take something we're really familiar with, like a net monetary benefit, an ICER, something like that. How do you account for that when possibly another part of what the technology's value proposition is more about implementation questions that aren't capturable through a net monetary benefit necessarily, but are important to a broader system process that maybe spreads across a variety of use cases or technological applications. How is that kind of value proposition getting accounted for here, especially if there's more than one purchaser or more than one stakeholder, more than one beneficiary from that investment? So all of that kind of work is getting touched on in early HTA. And again, I'm not saying that it isn't touched in all areas of HTA at all. Like, of course it is. But within the space of early HTA, they're talking about this in far more of okay, if we want to do these kinds of things, how do we do it ex ante of a technology? an ex ante of sufficient evidence, because any amount of evidence that gets produced is an expense, is a costly, both in terms of resources and time, to produce. And especially if you are, in my experience, because I focus with small and medium-sized enterprises, every dollar matters. Every dollar matters. And with researchers, it's the exact same. And so where do we put this money? How do we invest it appropriately? These are critical questions, and so as a result, the sort of intensity of some of these discussions is very much at the forefront of the methods discussion. So this same report, this is from the same publication, you'll see from those lists, I'm not going to go through this list, it's really a demonstration of just how broad the kinds of methods that are being captured as papers that are saying, I think in this study they had like 450 papers that ultimately that they reviewed. And they'd sort of listed out like these are the papers, like within these papers that identify themselves as an early HTA or one of those other terms that that we're sort of capturing as we think this is all kind of in the early HTA space. These are the methodologies that they had cited as part of their primary analysis, and it's wide. It's really a wide set of methodologies. And you'll see a different list, which is the IHE's version of this list in a slide or two. But it's really notable how broad the sets of methods are. I will admit some of these are really repetitive. Some of these are kind of sound the same. But it is noteworthy that this is a much broader set. So returning to this is a little bit of a pivot. Returning to that graph from slide 2 or so that I had said, if that bottom bit of the life cycle approach, I think is really interesting, around decision uncertainty. Let's dig into this a little bit more. And the reason I want to focus on this part is, in part, this is just my experience with practicing early HTA methods and exploring this space. At IHE, as I had mentioned, we have this early economic evaluation portfolio. We do many of these small scale early economic evaluations, these early HTAs for small and medium-sized enterprises. That those are sometimes companies, small entrepreneurial companies, sometimes they're researchers who just invented a product as part of their research. And in that process, we've identified some sort of common themes in what are the phases of demonstrating value and what are the methods that go into that. And I'm sort of going to use the degree of decision uncertainty as sort of the proxy for time in this case. And you'd start off with sort of you have that concept or discovery phase of an HTA life cycle. And then you have sort of a similar amount of decision uncertainty around the proof of concept of your technology, because you're not right now, the uncertainty that you're fulfilling is, does your technology even work? Can you make it? But then as you can get a proof of concept, now you're able to engage in more evidence development, and actually have more specific questions around its use cases. And then you ultimately reach early use, where you actually get to apply it, and it could be that you have market access, or it could just be that you have it in a pilot program of some sort. And then ultimately you have adoption, and obviously the space between each of these points is not to scale. But that's sort of the path of decision uncertainty. And at the early stages, the early HTA stages, we've identified a couple of key points. The first and foremost being just identifying stakeholders and the system need, and framing it as such. Who are the stakeholders? It's obviously whoever is producing this product is one. You have their intended purchaser is another. But the value proposition might represent a much broader set of stakeholders than is reflected there. And similarly, I'm specifying system need, because oftentimes the first step in the analysis becomes around reviewing what is the evidence and what is the headroom for improvement in technology in this space. If the system need is theoretical in nature, or sort of spoken about in a broader, not necessarily evidence-based, but sort of just the sense is that we could do things better. Well, how do we quantify that into some sort of form of headroom? That could be therapeutic headroom, economic headroom, or broader definitions of headroom. So there is identifying stakeholder system need that is largely an engagement process that does not stop. It's not something you do once. It is an ongoing discussion that follows over time and only gradually fades away as you get closer to use. And similarly with the evidence review and quantifying headroom, you might have time in which you're quantifying these things, but that headroom is going to change over time. Similarly, there is a point at which you are sort of able to take an evidence review, an initial quantification of the headroom of the system that is being modeled, and actually model it and start applying some figures to it that represent what is the current standard of care. Again, sort of you can think pathway modeling, where you just model what is currently going on. And then the type of analysis that you're doing might be something as simple as saying, okay, well, we don't actually know what the treatment effect of this technology is, but we know what the mechanisms of change are supposed to be. So let's apply either something, you could apply something like a relative risk, or you can apply an alternative branching system that's meant to represent improvement in standard of care that is standing in as the potential value of a technology that does what the proof of concept sort of mapped it out to be. This is the mechanism of change. This is the point in the treatment pathway or in the diagnostic process where the technology is meant to have improvement. Again, we don't know what the improvement is, but what is the potential for improvement? And this is also where value of information comes in. And obviously, value of information, it's been around for a while and we talk about it more and more, but it's still very novel to most people and to most of our stakeholders. It's a very novel thing. And just presenting value of information analysis that's based off of a standard of care model with this one or two applied treatment effects where we don't know the precise treatment effect. We're not trying to assert a treatment effect. We're simply saying, well, what is the headroom? How good could we be, and how beneficial would that be? And then valuing the value of information and of that model is tremendously powerful for a lot of stakeholders. It doesn't answer all the questions. It's not a replacement to a more complete analysis that could happen later. But it gives a much broader, or it gives a different set of outcomes. Again, going back to the definition, where the kinds of information and the kinds of decision insights that are being provided are different than a quote unquote traditional HTA. It's not necessarily about do we or do we not reimburse? Is this or is this not cost effective? Or what is the probability of it being cost effective? That's not necessarily the question. And the last point that I'd flag to this is, as part of that process, it is very possible that you are not quantifying the same things. The kinds of outputs that you are actually modeling are different than what health economists are more familiar with standard CEA, CUA approaches. The ways in which value proposition are being asserted might be a little bit more complicated and a little bit more specific to the needs of the system, the function of the technology, the kinds of stakeholders that have been identified, all of the things that you've done up to that point. These sort of build on each other and provide the level of insight necessary. And it makes it tricky. And I'll speak from experience. I'm happy to answer questions about any of this, but about this particular, it makes it that every one of the projects that we do is kind of its own weird unicorn, where we kind of have to generate new kinds of outputs, different kinds of threshold analyses, different kinds of decision curves. And that's actually a pretty good segue into sort of a list of these are the kinds of analysis that we've done as part of the E3 portfolio so far. This isn't meant to be like a sales pitch or anything. It's just literally like, this is the kinds of outputs and methods we've had to employ to do our analysis. And it really varies, and it's a little bit of everything. And so we have, I'd say the most common we have is something like a minimum effectiveness threshold, some sort of threshold analysis that we are doing that could take a variety of different forms, where we're saying, okay, what is to be considered cost effective in a simple sense? What is the minimum level of improvement we would need to see for the system to consider this worthwhile? That's a really common one. Again, it's actually getting sort of less common to apply, just because it's kind of we recognize the limitations of that interpretation of results, and it goes largely to that oftentimes the value proposition, like that version of threshold analysis, presumes that cost effectiveness is the factor that is dictating the decision making. That is not always the case, and so forcing people to listen to our willingness to pay threshold nonsense every single time. It's like half the time, it's like, guys, we don't make decisions like this. Like we don't care what the threshold is because this isn't how we value it. And so, learning about that and saying, okay, what are alternative thresholds that we can be applying? What are alternative methods of informing this stuff is really, it's a really interesting and rewarding area of work. Maximum reimbursable price frontiers, which is a fancy way of sort of a cost-based threshold. You have return on investment is a common one. Budget impact analysis, obviously, if you're going to a health institution or a health system, being able to sort of give them an estimate of the impact is important. It's not the same thing as a value proposition unless you're looking at a cost savings analysis, but it's part of what we do. Early economic or early HTAs, sort of within the literature, and we found this as well, where it can be part of it can sort of be like an opening salvo, a model that you build for the purposes of then putting it aside, having the information for the purposes of conferring some sort of initial insight, and then say, okay, now we're going to go do a trial or we're going to do a pilot study. And then once as we get data, we're going to directly update our economic model and see how it changes and see what it's looking like. And it could be redo value information on the basis of that. You can have almost like a real world expected value of sample information. That's not what it's called. I can't remember the exact terminology, the EVSI. You can do these kinds of things, and that's really cool. And we're even starting to implement this in like dashboard format so that they can do it sort of in real time as like part of a dashboard of the progress of their trials. And that's becoming really powerful and really popular. Similarly, pathway modeling, we had talked about that before. I'll get into it again. And I'm bending the rest of sort of falling under decision support, because it's not actually about getting to a quantification of the final analysis. It's about stakeholder engagement. It's about just the process of having conversations with people and being sort of that bridging agent that is talking to multiple stakeholders and asking questions around what is important, how do we need to what do we need to quantify in a value proposition, what is actually the metric of value that is going to dictate your decision making, and then translating that kind of information and the function of the technology, and sort of introducing a lot of the health economic concepts to people who may not be necessarily familiar with them. All of that kind of work I sort of categorize as decision support. And that, of course, includes value of information analysis, where it's about prioritizing, like identifying for researchers or for producers who are planning their trials, what kind of data to prioritize, and then telling them what that means. What does it mean to say you need better utility data? Well, you need to ask a different kind of set of questions. You might need to employ a survey, and sort of you start walking them down a path of saying, like, there's a whole sub methodology that if you want to do this kind of work, it's really important, but it's worth doing this work. This other work, not that important, because it doesn't actually drive the decision making. It doesn't drive difference in the outcomes according to our model. So don't worry about getting better data on that. But this other stuff, yeah, really spend time figuring out how to do this well, because this is going to dictate whether or not that cost effectiveness acceptability curve is giving you some really dynamic shifts, and there's a point at which it's definitely going to be cost effective, and the certainty will be high, things like that. Decision curve analysis, it's New technologies, I swear, like 70% of them are just improvements on diagnostics. So decision curve analysis is becoming a big thing that we're using. Implementation analysis, where it's trying to get into the weeds, really tough stuff for traditional economic models to incorporate issues of implementation, and how do you incorporate that into a system level model? That's another area that early HTA, there's whole subfields that are talking about early HTA, not using that terminology, but we're sort of finding them, and how to bring them in, and policy analysis. So I've talked a lot, more than I intended. I apologize. But I had a couple of sort of discussion points that I had sort of flagged. The first one, which is, I've described a bunch of methods. I've described a bunch of use cases. I don't have explicit answers to any of these questions. These are open to me. I don't have solid ones. Is anything that I've described so far, and for those who are familiar with these kinds of methods or employ them already, do you consider these things a significant departure in HTA methods? Or is this more of the same and we just added early at the beginning of it? I'd be interested in people's perspective on that. Two others that I would flag are how can, it sort of presumes the first answer is yes, there's an important difference, but how can health economists update our processes and methods to allow stakeholders, to provide stakeholders with the kind of analysis that captures their interpretation of value? How much do we need to work on this? And the third is, can and should we insist on some sort of early HTA to avoid wastage early on? There's so much early investment in R&D investment and general research fund investment that goes into improving evidence in the HTA space and in the broader health system space. Should some of these methods, as I've described, and should economic analysis more generally, and value information analysis more generally, be more explicit in those decision makings, in those early investment decision makings? And four, I leave open of there's probably plenty of things that I am not thinking about that people on the call would like to discuss. So I'm happy to open it up. Again, apologies, I went further than I thought. I apologize for that.
Thank you very much, Sasha, for this fantastic presentation. We now invite attendees to use the Q&A function on the Zoom software menu to ask their questions. Can give participants a few moments to type in their question.
Feel bad. There's the number of participants is staying the same. So people want to hear what people want to ask.
Okay, so the first question is from an anonymous attendee who's asking, or rather saying, this is more a comment than a question. If you insist on imposing EHTA too soon, you may hinder innovation.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there's in our experience at least, and I will admit that it's a limited one, more often than not, the hindrance of innovation is that they don't know how to actually take that proof of concept and implement it. There's a lot of risk associated with investing one's own time and effort and a company's resources towards a new technology, and having tools like what early HTA might provide to help bridge that initial proof of concept towards not just the trial phase and the early market adoption phase, but the ultimate decision-making phase, and giving them a bit more of a clearer path of what that looks like and what does it mean to have a better technology? What does a 1% improvement in X translate to in a health system context? Is actually a pretty potent piece of information that I very rarely have I actually had conversations with innovators, health technology innovators, who are doing these things out of love, out of oftentimes because they have family members or friends, or they personally have a health condition that they're like, we should do better, but they don't know how to translate that into broader decision making, or what the implications of improvement of a clinical outcome translate to a health system, whether or not the system considers it worth it. That's actually like a really powerful piece of insight that they don't have. We as health economists have a very odd way of thinking about this stuff, and it's very unique information. It's a very unique perspective that is not shared by a lot of people. And we don't have all of the answers to how to value something, but I see what you're saying. Like I agree in principle that like it could, like adding more steps to a process can be a hindrance. I think that it's then the question of, is the hindrance worth the outcome? And my argument would be like, I think there's a lot more we can try out first before we'll know the answer to that question about whether it's more of a hindrance or more of an improvement.
Thank you, Sasha. The next question is from William Hall. William says, great job, Sasha. A very important talk and area. I think there is a systematic lack of publication in this area, which contributes to the uncertainty here. Would be great to see your map populated with examples of what you have done with IHE at different stages and for different purposes. For me, I think the largest gap in knowledge exists within how healthcare systems make decisions. If there was a standardized approach / threshold / etc., it would make early HTA a lot easier. I think we should insist on early HTA.
Yeah, thanks, William. That's there's a lot of good stuff in terms of mapping and populate with examples of what we've done at IHE. Yeah, it's something that we're working on because it's still very much, I don't mind saying, like, it's exploratory stuff. Like we're customizing the design to fit the purposes, and we try to be as robust as possible, and we most of the time we can sort of pull off of existing methods guidance and make sure that we're doing things according to the valid processes, and and make sure we're reporting things appropriately. But it is still, like, especially when we're looking at how to sort of produce custom outputs that look at value proposition in a variety of different ways, it's really exploratory still. It is something we're trying to do. And yeah, I think that list that I had given you, that I had shown before, sort of this is what IHE's done so far. That's I would argue a pretty comprehensive list, I think, at this point, in terms of like the kinds of methods we've used. And I think there's lots of methods work that's been done around each of those, and we employ those. But yeah, I agree. It'd be good to sort of map that out, and it's part of the discussion. And yeah, there's a lack of publication in this space. If anyone who's interested in anything that I said today, like, especially if you're a graduate student or like, this is a big area where you could get in at a ground floor level. It's really early days for the sort of the formalization of some of these methods.
Thank you. We have a question from John Sproul in the chat function. So John is saying, Sasha, have you been asked to look at other jurisdictions and any work on Alberta companies looking at other markets? I mean, looking where Alberta may not be the market, but elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've been asked to look at other jurisdictions, and yes, that's true. Yeah, we have looked at other jurisdictions, and we focused on a lot of our clients are from Alberta because that's where the accelerator that we're partnered with, one of the accelerators that we're partnered with is out of, so they're interested in supporting Alberta-based organizations. But we've done work in BC. We've done work for across province. We've done work for companies that are looking to get into the United States, which is a whole other value proposition question. Not radically different, but different enough. And so yeah, these are absolutely questions that are getting asked in a variety of different jurisdictions, and they are all sort of identifying that there's a variety of ways of quantifying value proposition. The definition on the screen and the co-chairs of this process are, I believe they're both Dutch. They're both Yannick and Janet. Janet might be British, but I don't remember. But they're both out of the EU or the UK, and it's a whole area of work there as well. So there's lots of jurisdictions that are doing this space, that are working in this space. I also see John asked, what's the most common misunderstanding from SMEs in thinking about their potential value? The most common misunderstanding is that they don't know how decisions are actually made. They think that if they show that it is good, and if they show that it is potentially better than an existing technology by some metric, then it must be worth something, right? Well, that misses so many, like, they're not stupid. They don't, it's not like they're looking at this and being like, oh, well, it's better, so therefore you should buy this. Like, they understand price dynamics. They understand the expense associated with getting a fee code for something, or getting something listed, or the sunk costs associated with replacing an existing technology that's already been invested and put into facilities. They understand these things. But what they don't understand is what's considered worth it. Like, how it could be that their technology is more costly, but they don't know by what metric is value coming out of. So yeah, the most common misunderstanding, there's lots of little intricacies, but the most common one is just they don't actually know who is buying this product and how they value things. And a lot of the conversations we end up having is about things like when we're talking about health system perspective versus hospital perspective. That means a lot of things, especially to health economists and to modelers. But one of them is, that you might have an SME who is working with a hospital. They've partnered with a hospital, or they could be a clinical champion who has developed a method or technology that their hospital implements. And now they say, yeah, but now I want the health authority to pay for this. And it's like the health authority has a different quantification of what is valuable than the hospital does. The hospital, and I'm speaking very generally here, big scare quotes around this, but like the hospital does not make their decisions based off of a cost utility analysis. They assume or they don't assume, but when they've identified a certain level, a certain technology as having value for patient outcomes, that kind of becomes the end of that part of the conversation. It now becomes a question of means. Can we afford bringing this in? They trust their clinical champions. They trust the people who say this works. I want it. I need it. So they don't then turn around and the hospital does not then go, okay, but we need a cost utility analysis to make a decision. That's not what they do. The health system does. And so things like that are oftentimes the kinds of leaps of what is value to a decision maker that might be a potential purchaser.
Thank you very much, Sasha, again, for the great presentation and answering the questions. So anyone with further questions after today's webinar is encouraged to email noah@ihe.ca. The topic of the next NOAA seminar is a framework for the fair pricing of medicines, presented by Dr. Mike Holden on April 17th at noon. Please visit noah.ca to register and subscribe to our mailing list for news or upcoming events. Thank you to all attendees for attending today's presentation, and thanks again to Sasha. Have a great day. Bye.